Hi, Ben.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Doing very well this morning. Beautiful day.
Yes, thanks
How
for
are you
joining
doing?
me. Let me introduce us. I am Philip Menchaca, and this is meaningoflife.tv, available as a streaming audio and video podcast. You are Benjamin Zeller, professor of religion at Lake Forest College and author of Heaven's Gate, America's UFO Religion, as well as Prophets and Protons, New Religious Movements and Science in Late 20th Century America. And we are going to talk today about new religious movements and how they can sometimes foster violence, sometimes. Um, Particularly well-known examples that people may have heard of are Jonestown or Shinrikyo, the sarin gas attacks in Japan, and one in particular that you've studied, which is Heaven's Gate. Um, then we'll eventually kind of work our way to some bigger questions about culture and even, I hope, Donald Trump. So first, I just first wanted to ask you, though, how you became interested in studying new religious movements.
Oh, yeah, it was actually through Heaven's Gate.
Oh,
When the Heaven's Gate mass suicides occurred, which is 1997, so for those of the viewers and listeners who may need a sort of refresh, this was the group which ended with mass suicides. Hale-Bopp Comet was overhead. They had a home in Rancho Santa Fe, which is outside of San Diego, California, and they believed they were freeing their souls to follow the UFO, which they believed was following Hale-Bopp Comet. And all 39 active members of the group exited their bodies, as they referred to it. So this happened in '97. I was a college student at the time, and I was taking a course on Messianism and millennialism. So Messianism, beliefs about the Messiah, and millennialism, beliefs about the end of the world. And it was taught by an older Jesuit fellow who was focusing primarily on ancient and early medieval examples. I asked him, hey, can I study this group? Because it seems like it's somewhat relevant. And he said, sure, go ahead. So I started researching it, and it became the focus for my senior thesis when I was an undergraduate. And then I never really left it aside when I went into grad school. And then as I started to study new religious movements professionally, I always wanted to come back to Heaven's Gate. So it took me a while. It wasn't my first book, but it was something which I kept thinking about, and I really wanted to understand the story and truly try to understand the people and the very sort of extreme, radical decision they made to end their lives.
yeah.
That's got into it.
hmm And can you define, the Heaven's Gate is referred to as a new religious movement. Can you define what that means, what a new religious movement is?
Sure, yes. So there's different ways of defining it. Maybe the easiest is to say that it's a term scholars came up with because we don't like the term cult or sect, both of which have sort of pejorative meanings.
Yeah.
The example I often give is if you're in Texas, Southern Baptists are the establishment. If you're in Russia, Southern Baptists are legally described as a cult, or the Russian equivalent of a cult.
Hmm.
So cult has come to mean a religion we don't like. It used to have a much more rich sociological meaning, but scholars are really hesitant saying something is a cult because in the popular parlance, people think, well, that means it's a bad religion.
Right.
So what we tend to have meant by cult or sect is that they're small, they're newly formed, they usually have a charismatic leader. We don't mean to castigate them or make any value judgment about them. So we shifted to that term new religious movement instead of cult or sect. But I like it because it's really broad. A new religious movement is not a new religion. It's a social movement. That's where the movement comes from. So it doesn't need to have all of the sort of the fully fleshed out forms that we expect in an actual religion with sacred texts and holidays and practices and places of worship. Sometimes it's very sort of inchoate. It's just forming.
hmm
And as a new religious movement, often it's actually a branch off of an existing group. So it doesn't have everything you might expect in a full-blown religion. Some of the older ones certainly do, so that the new religious movements which formed 50, 60 years ago are indistinguishable from any other world religions. But the new ones that are in the act of forming maybe don't have it all quite figured out just yet. And they're
Yeah.
often fun to study
I,
as a scholar, to look at a religion as it's forming.
are there any contemporary examples of that kind of inchoate religious group that's maybe not quite what people would expect to see as a religion, but
Yeah. A lot of the really good examples are actually in Eastern Europe and former Soviet areas because there had been this real sort of enforced lack of religion, right? So then,
right.
as after the fall of the Soviet Union, And after the end of sort of enforced atheism, there was this spiritual yearning. And we see all these sort of new religions that are popping up all over Eastern Europe and in Russia. Often they do have a charismatic leader, or they have sort of a sacred text, but sort of the practices and the communities are sort of always shifting in terms of they really haven't nailed down exactly what the groups are about. But there's often sort of this spiritual quest. China is a big example too.
Okay.
There's a number of sort of Chinese leaders. I was just reading an article that we have in press in the journal I co-edit, which is on new religious movements. It's called Nova Religio, and we have a new article coming out about some of these sort of Chinese new religious movements, which often fuse aspects of Confucianism, of Taoism, but also Maoism and state religion as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a state sort of civic religion. So there's all sorts of groups. The U.S., it's a little more, our new religions are sort of the older ones, or they're really under the radar. A lot of the groups are groups I just haven't heard of yet, because if they have 50, 100 members and they're tucked away somewhere, they haven't done anything to attract much interest. How would I know about them?
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I think people are interested in new religious movements and how they come to be known is, unfortunately, through violence.
Yeah. The ones we know about are the ones that do something spectacularly bad, usually.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there particular factors that are, maybe you could say, necessary, but not sufficient, perhaps, for violence to manifest in these religions?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research done on this by sociologists, by historians, by psychologists. It's really hard to tell because there's really very few examples. If we were natural scientists working in a lab, it would be like trying to make some sort of statement about cellular biology by looking at only 10 cells. There's basically no more than a dozen or so new religious movements which have been involved in any level of sort of collective group violence. There are many new religious movements that had individual members who were accused of violent crimes, but that's true of every religion. And we have to distinguish between a religion which has some sort, or a religious movement which has some sort of violence attached to it, and a group which happens to have a member who did something violent that doesn't connect to the religion. So, but of the groups we've looked at, and there's a few big ones. You mentioned Jonestown, Jonestown, People's Temple, the Branch Davidians with the big siege in Waco in mid-90s, Aum Shinrikyo you mentioned as well, Solar Temple, which was a Francophone new religious movement, had suicides and murder, Heaven's Gate. The Ugandan example is the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. But really beyond that, it's hard to think of a lot of such groups. The commonalities we do see are there are internal factors which led to either some sort of collapse or some sort of opening up for problems, and then there's usually external factors as well.
Okay.
And it's when you have both internal factors and external factors lining up that you have real propensity for violence or tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And very rare examples.
So, I guess one example would be like in Jonestown, where you had the senator come and visit them,
Yeah.
right? Which played into this narrative about persecution by the government.
So exactly, really good example. So Jonestown, you had internal factors. So you had Jim Jones, who seemed to be getting increasingly paranoid, perhaps with or without reason, thinking that the CIA was out to get him. They relocate to South America. They think World War III is coming. They think that a race war is coming. Remember, they were an interracial group right in the 70s. So they thought that the white government, the man, was going to come and get them. And then what happened? The man came to get them as far as they were concerned, right? So you happen to the internal and external factors line up together, where all of their fears were played into, where Jones and sort of his lieutenants really thought that the U.S. government was going to come and get them. And all of a sudden they see the senator show up with the press, and they think that it's happening, and they're afraid their group is going to spiral out of their control, and they're all going to be arrested and thrown into prisons. They thought they were going to be enslaved. They thought they were just going to be, snuck off and executed in the middle of the jungle somewhere. And they decided to take matters into their own hands. And you have the cases of the murder-suicides. I mean, those weren't just suicides. Those were clearly murders as well.
Right.
And the internal and external factors lined up, perfectly from an academic perspective. Obviously, it wasn't a perfect thing, but it's
right.
Yeah.
So I'd like to turn now to the group that you've studied, or one of the groups you've studied in depth, which is Heaven's Gate. Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about what happened there, and then the story with these 39 members committed suicide in 1997. Yeah. Can you give us a sense of maybe a little bit more in-depth history of the group?
Sure, yeah. So they were about 20 years old when the movement ended. The group had been around about 20 years. So they started in the 70s. They had two co-founders, Marshall Herff Applewhite and Bonnie Lou Nettles. They were both already basically older adults, almost middle-aged by the time they founded the movement. Came out of Texas. He was interested in astrology, in music. He was raised Presbyterian but had left the church. Nettles was the co-founder. She was a nurse, also interested in astrology and the New Age. They were both sort of looking for some sort of spiritual connection. They met each other, decided that they had a mission in life, and that mission was to figure out what their spiritual identities were and what their destinies were. They started studying very, very broadly. They studied Christianity, they studied New Age movement, they studied Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism they looked at, studied a lot of the Bible, and discovered and decided that they were actually extraterrestrials who had come back to Earth on a particular mission. And this mission was to let humanity know that there was a way to overcome our human condition and evolve beyond our human natures into extraterrestrial beings. And they gathered a flock of people, never very large, a couple hundred people at most in the 70s, who dedicated themselves to overcoming their human natures and evolving beyond humanity into sort of perfected beings from outer space, which they called next-level aliens. And there's basically the same thing as an angel. So basically they saw themselves as evolving into angelic forms. And then they would sail around in the universe and take care of the planets, much like most Jews or Christians or Muslims would say that would sort of there's angels that take care of Earth and sort of help God. So too they said they were going to be sort of these angelic beings sailing around on spaceships and taking care of the universe. And here's where it gets sort of sci-fi, very similar to Star Trek. So if you've seen Star Trek, the Enterprise sails around in outer space, and its crew sort of helps people. And so they said it was basically the same thing, except that they would be sort of these eternal angelic beings that would be sailing around the universe and taking care of planets and helping sort of civilizations.
Is there evidence that they were actually influenced by Star Trek? Did they reference that in their writings or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's a debate among scholars whether they were influenced or not. It's really hard to tell. Yeah. So several members, and Applewhite himself, towards the end of the movement's history, actually said that sometimes the next level, which is how they referred to heaven and sort of God, sometimes the next level makes itself known through culture, through sort of inspiring artists. So it's possible that Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was inspired, but far more likely they just saw it as sort of a parallel and a way to reach people. So they actually famously had. In the early 90s, they had a newspaper advertisement they took out in USA Today, ran across the country, in which they used Star Trek language to try to appeal to people and said that if you can believe Star Trek, then you can believe us. And I did have an ex-member actually tell me once that if I really wanted to learn about Heaven's Gate, I should watch not Star Trek, but it was another series. It was Stargate. I should watch Stargate.
Oh, Stargate.
Would give me a good example of their theology before I even started studying it. So they believe that there's sort of value in pop culture. But I should say, there are evangelical Christians who said, well, if you really want to understand what the end of the world is about, you should go read the Left Behind series.
Yes.
A fictionalized version of sort of evangelical theology. So, one could imagine that there's other examples too. Someone might say, if you want to understand what Judaism is about, go read The Chosen, or go read Exodus, certainly. Not the biblical book, but the book about Nazi persecution, so to understand sort of what Judaism is about. So there's plenty of other sort of real-world examples of religious movements that might say, well, you can look at sort of fiction to understand what we're about.
Yeah. So did they have a belief that there was a whole community of next level beings in outer space, and that the goal was to go and join them?
Exactly, yeah. And so let me, I have the book here, and in here there's a picture of what they thought they looked like. Here we go. So you can find this all online. Heaven's Gate, the website is still up, but this is what they thought they were becoming. Okay. It's sort of that sort of happy, content, peaceful-looking space alien. So we're not talking like the Ridley Scott style aliens, tentacles and all that stuff.
It's very human looking.
What was that?
It's very human looking.
It's very human looking, but also content, peaceful, almost childlike. If they were influenced by anything, I think they were influenced by Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the Spielberg vision of of alien civilization as being peaceful and exploratory and sort of almost mystical and almost sort of transcendent.
Mm-hmm. So, are there any particular commonalities between the people that joined Heaven's Gate?
Yes, the commonality is that they were pretty much all spiritual seekers, and there are different phases of the group's movement, or of the movement's history. Most members joined in the 70s. I remember there were several hundred members by that point, and then a few joined later on in the 80s and 90s. But throughout the time periods, the people who joined had been spiritual seekers who had experimented with other religious traditions, alternative religions, religious practices. In the 70s, often it had been psychedelic drugs or communes. In the 80s and 90s, it was more likely to be a New Age movement or meditation or yoga. But there are people who joined Scientology, transcendental meditation, things like that. And for one reason or another, they all sort of kept going, and they didn't stick with one of those traditions. They got into Heaven's Gate, and most of the members actually left. Remember, they had several hundred people, and they were down to 40 by the end. So most joined. They did some spiritual seeking at Heaven's Gate, and they kept going. And a few stuck around and decided this was what they had actually been looking for. But yeah, almost all of them, or all of them, either were spiritual seekers or were open to seeking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I guess this brings us to the question then, what brought members of the group to the point where, the mass suicide seemed like the way to go?
Sure. So they believed that that they were not of the earth, and they wanted to get off the earth. They saw themselves increasingly as extraterrestrials, as aliens stuck on the planet. Initially, Heaven's Gate taught that you would biologically, chemically transform your body. If you look at their very first materials they published in the 70s, very scientific language, biology, cells, chemistry, chemicals, sort of, it's all this language about the body itself transforming. And then in the mid-'80s, the co-founder, Bonnie Lou Nettles, she passes away. She gets liver cancer and metastasizes, and she dies. And it's very clear that her body is not going to transform into an extraterrestrial being. They have to cremate and bury the body. So they decide, well, okay, her soul has moved beyond the body. The soul transformed, and the soul has freed itself to go on to the next level. So in the 90s, as the group is getting older, and they start to have the same conversation, what's going to happen? And they come to the conclusion that they are probably going to have to leave their bodies. And they said, well, what's going to happen? Are we going to leave our bodies one at a time? Are we going to voluntarily leave our bodies? Are we going to be killed? And they try to figure out what's going to happen. And for a while, they think, well, maybe the government's going to come kill us. This is after the Branch Davidians, right? So after the Branch Davidian raid in '93, they think, well, the government's gonna come find us and they're gonna kill us all. The thing is, the Heaven's Gate wasn't on the government's radar. They hadn't done anything illegal. There wasn't much interest in them. Yeah. So the leaders of the movement said, well, the government's not going to kill us, so what are we going to do? They said, well, we can wait. Each of us can die individually of old age. But it was a communal group. They saw themselves as a family. They saw themselves as a class. They didn't want to just sort of watch their members die off one by one. They decided that they would leave intentionally as a group. That they had no longer needed their human bodies. They had evolved beyond them. Therefore, they would free their souls to go on to the next level and just leave their bodies behind. And the metaphor they used was a vehicle, that their body was a vehicle. But they had parked the vehicle, they'd opened the door, and they had got out. It was time to leave it. Just like you don't, if you're going to a sporting event, you don't stay in your vehicle after you park it at the parking lot. You get out and you walk into the stadium. Mm-hmm. So too, they were going to go on to their next mission in the universe, and they could leave their human bodies behind.
Yeah, and this is what you referred to in your book, I believe, as the euphemization of violence, correct?
Yes. Yeah, it's instead of referring to it as suicide, it becomes euphemized as leaving behind a vehicle. Elsewhere, they call it an upload. They say that the data is going to be uploaded, that we're going to leave behind the old hardware. So the body becomes a discarded computer. The body becomes an old car. It becomes completely euphemized, where the euphemism is that it's an upload or it's a transfer, not a suicide, not a death.
Mm-hmm. And that makes it easier, I think, to then engage in that act if you see it in those terms. Yeah. And they actually had a big document which they wrote before the suicides on why it wasn't a suicide, why it was actually better called an exit. An Earth exit. Suicide, they believed, would be if they had not done what they did.
Suicide was to not join the next level, to stick themselves on this planet. They believed in reincarnation, so they believed that if they didn't free their souls to go on to the next level, that they would be stuck on this planet for thousands of years, reincarnating over and over again. This is the Buddhist or Hindu concept of samsara, right? They believed they would be stuck in samsara, reincarnating over and over and over again, until thousands of years from now they'd have another chance to join the next level.
So
suicide was choosing to stay in samsara. Suicide wasn't what they did. I don't know if they were influenced by Buddhism explicitly in that regard, but certainly one could look at the examples of Buddhist self-immolators. You know, the Buddhist monks who set fire to themselves as protests and said that this was not a form of suicide; it was a form of calling attention to injustice. And this wasn't sort of a death of the body so much as a freeing of the essence of the self.
Yeah.
Or the self, if you're Buddhist.
So I think some people, I mean, this is very interesting, and just kind of a sensational example. It gets people's attention. But I think some people may say, well, this is a few dozen people who actually killed themselves. This is a small group, a few hundred people. Why study it? What's the value in understanding this?
A couple of answers to that. One is, even though it's a small group, it's a group which did something radical, which did something intentional, and the response to it was such that it demands our attention. Immediately after the suicides occurred, Ted Turner, who was CNN's founder and owner at the time, came out and said, "Well, it's a good way to get rid of a few nuts." Mm-hmm. And by and large, the treatment from the media was basically to make fun of these people, was to say, well, they were crazy, they were deluded. Newsweek had an article where they said that basically that they believed in nonsense, that it was a bunch of mishmashed, nonsensical theology. If about 40 people or so, and by the end there were 39 members who committed suicide, and there were a few sort of ex-members who decided later on to commit suicide as well. So you have about 40 people or so. If 40 people believe something strongly enough to make the ultimate decision to end their lives, I think we have to take it seriously enough to at least try to study it. And I think that it merits our serious consideration. But I also think that they spoke to much broader trends in the society and the culture around them. They believed that life of this planet was not as important as the afterlife. And in that regard, they actually line up with many other religious people who would say the same thing, who would say that what's more important is the afterlife and not what happens on this planet. Christian martyrs 2,000 years ago said the same thing, right? They said that, they'd rather go to their deaths and die at the young age of even teenagers or even children. And they'd rather have children die on this planet, but get a fortunate afterlife than live to a ripe old age. And that's where all that sort of martyrology comes from. Yeah. Even more than that, Heaven's Gate spoke to its moment. This was a group which was interested in sort of the end of the world and in the millennialism. They were right before the Y2K, so it was right before, there were all these groups that had these fears that the end of the world was coming. Heaven's Gate was also, members of Heaven's Gate were deep believers in conspiracies. They believed that there was a conspiracy of extraterrestrials that were running. There were both good extraterrestrials and bad extraterrestrials. There were the angelic beings they wanted to be, but there were also these demonic extraterrestrials as well. And they said the demonic ones were behind plots to control the world's governments and the world's banks. If you look at current affairs, as we're recording this, just a few weeks ago, just last week, Donald Trump gave this big speech in Florida where he said that the banks were behind his fall in the polls, and there was a conspiracy. That's the same sort of language they believed in too. There was a conspiracy. The conspiracy was out to get them and out to get the few good people. And that in the case of Heaven's Gate, the conspiracy involved bankers, it involved the government, it involved the media, it involved these aliens, it involved the military, that everyone was lined up to get the few good people. And this they deeply believed in. And frankly, this has become pretty popular in the years since Heaven's Gate passed. Yeah,
I think you do see similar strains of thought in in current political discourse. And I do want to get to Donald Trump, but first I just want to ask one further question along this line of Heaven's Gate. And, you said something about comparing the belief that the afterlife, that there is this parallel between a belief that the afterlife is more important than belief here, is the same in mainstream religions versus what Heaven's Gate thought. And it's true. I once had someone say to me, I can't wait to die because then I'll go to heaven and be with God, which struck me as kind of strange. And all this leads me to ask, what is different about a group like Heaven's Gate than a mainstream religion that would cause them to take that step then to actually commit suicide?
I'm going to let sort of people who witnessed it speak for themselves. I remember reading right after the events. I spent a lot of time looking at the religious press, what religious newspapers, magazines were saying in response to it. And most religious people rushed out and condemned and really othered Heaven's Gate and said, well, this is a cult, a dangerous cult. They were heretics. They believed in nonsense. They were nothing. There was one article, actually there were two articles. There was one I read in Christian Science, in the Christian Science Monitor. It was an editorial, and the editorial said, we shouldn't be so quick to judge because ultimately their theology is not so different from the rest of ours, where ours was Christian. And there was a very similar editorial. It was in the I'm blanking on which journal it was in, but it was a mainstream Protestant journal, and it was the same sort of an editorial which said it's really easy to reject them, but in fact the theology is not that different. Basically, they're saying that life on this earth is a tryout for the life to come, and that what's important is not so much succeeding in this life and ending up with a big house and a lot of money, but living your life in such a way that you merit entrance into this world to come. And it was very few examples. I think there were only two, as I said, where I saw that. But I think that to answer your question, what is the difference ultimately? The difference is nothing. The difference is that these are 39 individuals who tried to live their lives as best they could, tried to make sense of the world around them, tried to get through the pain and suffering and live with the joys that they encountered in their lives and find some sort of meaning. And ultimately what they found was a set of answers which said, you have to give up this life and you have to focus on getting into a heaven. And that's what they chose to do. And a lot of other people choose to do the same thing. It's just that they don't force the issue and commit suicide to get there.
Yeah. Okay, well, now turning to current events, I guess. Turning to current events.
Sure.
There have been a few people that have made the argument that Donald Trump's hardcore supporters bear some resemblance to religious movements. There was, I think, most recently in the New Republic, Jared Sexton had this article that said something along the lines of Donald Trump's campaign has become a cult. What do you think about that line of argument?
Well, so I don't like the cult word because I think it's the pejorative way to say, it's some other group I don't like. However, I think that there's a lot going on in the Donald Trump movement, Trumpism, if we're going to call it that, which looks either, if not religious, sort of quasi-religious. So by quasi-religious, I mean it sort of acts and looks like religion, even if it's not sort of explicitly a religion. What I see in particular is the messianism. I actually started our interview by talking about messianism. I said I was taking this class on messianism, which got my interest in Heaven's Gate way back in the 90s. But messianism is a current we see in many religious traditions that looking for the savior figure who's going to fix things. The messianism says that the world is screwed up right now, that we're having troubles, we're having problems, but that God or the gods or someone has a plan, and that plan involves someone who's going to come and is going to save us. And in different traditions, you get different sort of messianic figures. Obviously, most people are familiar within Christianity, there's the idea of Jesus as the Christ. Christ is just the Greek word for the Messiah. So you have Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah, who comes not just to save the world, but to save humanity, to save everyone. Within Judaism, you have this longing for the Messiah to come, who's going to sort of help return Jews out of the diaspora back to Israel to rebuild the temple, that everything's going to get better again. Trumpism looks very much like sort of a secular political messianism, right? So Trump stands in front of his fellow Republicans in his acceptance speech at the convention and says, "Only I can save us. That we have trouble, that the world is falling apart, the U.S. is in disarray, that society is collapsed, basically, and that you need me to save you." It was an intensely sort of millennial message that the world is falling apart, the country is falling apart, things are bad, and only I can save you. That is millennial language, that is messianic language. That is language which Hillary Clinton has been very careful not to embrace. Hillary Clinton never says the world is falling apart and you need me to save you. So she's explicitly taken a sort of anti-messianic perspective of herself. Whereas Trump has embraced this messianic language, and he even has embraced sort of this, you might want to call it millennial paranoia, right? Believers in millennialism, sort of end of the world apocalyptic language, often see sort of broad conspiracies working against them, and they see malignant forces. New world orders or sort of the Whore of Babylon, it depends on what sources you're looking at, but that something big and evil is up against them, the Antichrist. And Trump has embraced this. He sees malignant forces moving against him. Lift up any rock, and underneath that you'll find someone aligned against Trump and against Trumpism and against Trump's people. Right? Because it isn't just Trump, it's about his people, it's about his supporters. And for them, the world is lined up against them. The world has it out against them, and they see in Trump a savior, a messiah, someone who can fix the world and make it better for them. So on that level, I think we can think about it as something akin to a new religious movement, if we want to use that religious movement language. It's not a religion, but it's a social movement, and it looks sort of religious.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about how you bring people who have that mindset into a conversation about the factors that led them to join that? I mean, in the case of Heaven's Gate, join a group like that, or join a campaign like Trump's campaign.
Sure. So some of the sociologists who looked at new religious movements in the mid-century said that behind every sort of set of millennial or apocalyptic or messianic expectations and fears and anxieties is a kernel of truth. Mm-hmm. And if you figure out what that kernel of truth is, that tells you why these people are so upset. So the scholars who were looking at those were looking at some of these urban sort of African American millennial movements in mid-century, groups like the Father Divine movement, or groups like the Nation of Islam. And they said that the kernel of truth that are behind sort of the rise of these movements is racism, and it's urban poverty. So for a group like Heaven's Gate, what is behind sort of their longing to find a extraterrestrial messiah? It's that these people did not feel like they fit in American culture. They did not feel like they fit in our society for one reason or another. Most people who joined were people who rejected materialism. They said they did not want to be part of the rat race of trying to get a good job and make a bunch of money and buy a house and have a car and 2.2 children and a dog and a white picket fence. And they said, we reject all this, and they instead embrace a religious movement which said the goal is to get off the planet. They lived as monks. They lived as monks and nuns. They rejected sexuality. They rejected private property. This is a picture of how some of them lived, right? Dressing up basically like monks, right? So they said, we want to live like monastics. We want to get off the planet. And the kernel of sort of truth underneath sort of all of their sort of fears and all of their sort of anxieties was that they were not comfortable with late 20th century American materialism, at least in my reading of it. There's lots more you can say with it, but if you want to find something that sort of they all have in common.
Yeah.
For supporters of Trumpism, I think the actual fact is that for many Americans in the 21st century, the way of life which they have envisioned, which is modeled on sort of 1950s America, is gone. Small town America from Ozzie and Harriet, where you can be a high school graduate and get a good job and live sort of a nice middle class life, living amongst people who look just like you and talk just like you and go to the same church as you do, that's gone. We live in a diverse society. We live in a society where you have to be highly educated to get ahead. We live in a global society, and sort of the small town 1950s America that they want is, to be honest, if it hasn't faded, it's fading. And that, to me, is the kernel of truth at the core of their longing for a Messiah to save them. And I think unless we take them seriously, then we won't understand what they're so upset about.
Yeah.
I'm not a Trump supporter, so I think it's probably pretty obvious. But I understand why they're upset. This is not to excuse their racism. Many of the proponents of Trumpism are racist. Many of them are classist. Many of them are xenophobic. But if you want to find something rational behind that, it's a fear that what the life that they want to live is gone, that they just can't have it anymore.
Yeah, that's a hard problem. It's a very hard problem, and it's.
I'm not an economist. I can't tell you how to solve it. But I recognize that if you want to live in sort of 1950s America, you can't anymore. It's gone.
Yeah,
it's gone.
And it's difficult because it hurts people. It has small manufacturing towns. Those jobs aren't coming back, and well, it's a difficult problem of the day. I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This has been very interesting.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk about our work and how hopefully it sort of connects to contemporary issues and is helpful for understanding the world around us.
Yeah, so I encourage people to go out and read more about this.
I'll hold it up so you can see what the front looks like. You can buy it, Amazon and everywhere else.
Yeah, it's a fascinating account, and I think we've talked a little bit about how it reflects broader trends in American culture. So thanks so much, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Yeah, take care.
Bye-bye.